Thanks for joining us. This is OmniView, episode 31 for April 11th, 2026. As always, our mission is to examine the day's biggest stories from multiple genuine perspectives, left, right, center, and international, so you can weigh the evidence and form your own conclusions. No spin, no agenda, just the clearest view we can provide of a complicated world. Let's begin with the story that's shaping nearly everything else in today's news. Senior Iranian officials arrived in Islamabad today for the highest level direct ceasefire negotiations with the United States in 40 years. This marks day 43 of the US-Iran conflict, a confrontation that began with a rapid escalation few analysts predicted would last this long. Vice President JD Vance is personally leading the American side, accompanied by longtime Trump confidant Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. President Trump, speaking publicly before the talks began, delivered a characteristically blunt message. The United States is loading naval vessels with what he called the best ammunition anywhere in the world, while simultaneously predicting that the Strait of Hormuz, the critical oil artery, will reopen very soon. The tone and framing of these talks vary sharply depending on the outlet. The Daily Mail portrays the moment as a terrifying geopolitical crossroads, citing experts who warn that any strategic misstep by Vance could collapse the entire peace effort and plunge the region into deeper chaos. Al Jazeera, by contrast, reports the developments in a more restrained, factual style, emphasizing that weeks of quiet but intense Pakistani shuttle diplomacy finally produced a shared public commitment from Washington, Tehran, and Islamabad to sit down face-to-face. Business-focused outlets such as Bloomberg connect the talks immediately to global energy markets, noting record outflows from Indian equities and growing warnings of potential jet fuel shortages if the strait remains blocked. Some conservative voices frame Trump's public military rhetoric as necessary maximum pressure that strengthens America's negotiating position. Others, including several European and progressive commentators, see the combination of high-level diplomacy and simultaneous threats of escalated force as contradictory at best and dangerously escalatory at worst. What's interesting here is that both sides actually agree on one core historical fact. These are indeed the most senior direct contacts between Washington and Tehran in 4 decades. Where they diverge sharply is on the question of whether overt military posturing ultimately creates leverage or poisons the atmosphere for a durable ceasefire. The deeper issue worth considering is what concrete incentives actually exist right now for both capitals to compromise. For Washington, an acceptable deal would presumably secure freedom of navigation through the strait and limit Iran's regional proxy activities. For Tehran, relief from economic pressure and a face-saving way to stand down without appearing defeated may be essential. At the same time, both leaders must speak to domestic audiences, Trump to a base that rewards strength, Iranian leadership to a population weary of sanctions and isolation. Public rhetoric designed for home consumption can easily become an obstacle once the closed-door talks begin. We'll be watching closely to see whether the two tracks, threat and negotiation, can reinforce rather than undermine each other. That same strategic uncertainty is already producing tangible economic ripples, which brings us to our next story. The Airports Council International has formally written to the European Union warning of systemic jet fuel shortages across the continent if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for an extended period. The narrow waterway, through which roughly 1/5 of global seaborne oil typically passes, has become the central point of tension in the current conflict. With summer holiday travel season approaching, the letter underscores the risk that millions of leisure and business travelers could face sharply higher fares, reduced schedules, or outright fuel rationing. Coverage of this warning splits along predictable but illuminating lines. Mail online stories tend to emphasize the direct threat to ordinary vacationers, framing the shortage as an almost inevitable reality if the strait is not reopened within the next few weeks. Bloomberg and other financial outlets embed the fuel issue inside a larger pattern of economic anxiety, pointing to record capital flight out of Indian stock markets driven by fears of a prolonged energy shock. Some voices, particularly those aligned with a more hawkish view, describe Iran's reported toll booth policy on shipping as a de facto blockade that justifies strong international pushback, including potential military measures to restore freedom of navigation. Other analysts see the closure itself as the predictable downstream consequence of months of military escalation and heated rhetoric from multiple capitals. Across virtually all reporting, one variable remains undisputed: The physical status of the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important dial controlling how severe these disruptions become. The open question is how quickly alternative supply routes, strategic reserves, or tanker rerouting around Africa could blunt the impact. The question worth considering is how directly this story reveals the connection between geopolitical decisions made halfway around the world and the everyday costs felt by consumers. A tanker delayed in the Persian Gulf can translate into higher airfares in Europe, canceled flights in Asia, and anxious holiday planning in households that have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. It's a vivid reminder that abstract great power competition has concrete pocketbook consequences. After weeks dominated by conflict and economic anxiety, today also delivered a genuinely uplifting counterpoint from the realm of science and exploration. NASA's Artemis II crew has returned safely to Earth after a 10-day mission that took them farther into deep space than any humans since the Apollo era. The four-person international team, NASA astronauts Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, together with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, splashed down precisely in the Pacific Ocean. The mission successfully tested the Orion spacecraft's life support systems, heat shield, and re-entry capabilities in preparation for future crewed lunar landings. Media treatment of the homecoming has been broadly positive, though emphases differ. Mail online coverage celebrates the triumphant return, lingering on the astronauts' surprisingly good physical condition and the emotional scenes aboard the recovery ships. President Trump's planned White House welcome ceremony is presented by some outlets as evidence of continued strong American leadership in space. Many reporters and commentators, regardless of their usual political leanings, treat Artemis II as a rare bipartisan success story that seems to transcend the geopolitical tensions dominating the rest of the news cycle. Several pieces also note the striking emotional contrast. While diplomats and warships maneuvered in the Middle East, a small international crew was quietly advancing humanity's reach beyond low Earth orbit. What stands out is how the participation of Canada and the visible international character of the crew appears to broaden public ownership of the program. The question worth considering is why space exploration often feels especially resonant during periods of earthly conflict. There's something powerful about watching humans cooperate on a scale larger than any single nation at the very moment nations are threatening one another on the ground. In an anxious world, the sight of a successful splashdown may serve as a reminder that long-term, peaceful ambitions can still move forward even when immediate headlines feel dark. Shifting from the heavens back to domestic policy, a significant change in how America registers young men for potential military service is now taking effect. New procedures will automatically enroll millions of young men, including, in certain cases, undocumented immigrants, into the selective service system. The change stems from legislation President Trump signed in December, and the Pentagon is currently moving forward with implementation. What was once a process that required individuals to proactively register will now happen through data matching with other government records. Reactions have split along familiar partisan and philosophical lines. Mail Online and several conservative-leaning outlets report sharp criticism from opponents who accuse the administration of quietly preparing for endless war and expanding the draft pool at a moment of heightened global tension. Supporters counter that the automation is simply a straightforward modernization that removes outdated paperwork burdens and ensures the selective service has the most accurate possible database. The inclusion of certain undocumented immigrants has drawn particularly heated criticism from some quarters, with phrases like "sick twist" appearing in commentary. Others respond that the policy merely reflects long-standing legal requirements that registration is tied to residency and certain benefits, rather than citizenship status. Importantly, the core facts of the December law and the current implementation timeline are not seriously disputed across the spectrum. The deeper question worth considering is the real difference between registration and actual conscription. Registration is essentially a database. It does not mean anyone is being drafted. Yet public reaction at this particular moment seems to reflect broader anxieties about military readiness, the direction of American foreign policy, and the equity of who bears the burden of national defense. In a time when conflict with Iran is already stretching resources, even bureaucratic updates to the draft system take on heightened symbolic weight. These tensions are also testing America's oldest military alliance. In London, Prime Minister Keir Starmer delivered a strong public endorsement of NATO, calling it the single most effective military alliance the world has ever known. The statement came shortly after President Trump once again escalated his threats to withdraw the United States from the alliance if European partners do not dramatically increase their defense spending. The exchange is playing out against the backdrop of the US-Iran conflict and repeated European calls for greater burden sharing. Perspectives on this transatlantic friction differ markedly. Mail Online coverage, including a column by Andrew Neil, portrays Starmer's recent Gulf tour and rhetorical support for NATO as largely performative, labeling the Prime Minister a phony cowboy who has allowed Britain's influence to be sidelined. Bloomberg reports that Starmer is accelerating planned increases in UK defense spending, in part to shore up his own domestic political position. European voices tend to stress NATO's historic role in preserving peace on the continent, and argue that Europe must shoulder more of the financial load without delay. Trump-aligned perspectives, by contrast, view the threat of withdrawal as useful leverage, tough love designed to force fairer contributions from allies who have underspent for years. Across nearly all reporting, the underlying facts remain consistent. Trump has renewed his criticism and Starmer has responded with strong public support for the alliance. The question worth considering is how the ongoing Iran conflict is influencing NATO cohesion in real time. Does it demonstrate the continued necessity of the alliance, or does it expose its fractures? Equally important are the domestic political incentives shaping both leaders' statements. For Trump, pressure on NATO plays to a long-standing base skepticism of multilateral institutions. For Starmer, vocal support for the alliance may help him look statesmanlike at a moment when his government faces multiple domestic pressures. The interplay between international crisis and domestic politics rarely produces simple answers. Stepping back, what ties many of these stories together is something most single news outlets rarely highlight. The same underlying events are being viewed through entirely different lenses depending on the editorial priorities of the source. Security-focused coverage tends to foreground military posture, negotiating leverage, alliance reliability, and questions of deterrence. Business and economic coverage, by contrast, zooms in on immediate market reactions, disruptions to fuel supply chains, capital flight from emerging markets like India, and forecasts for global growth. This creates parallel narratives that sometimes feel as though they are describing different realities, even when the underlying facts overlap. One outlet may lead with record outflows from Indian stocks. Another may lead with dire warnings about summer holiday travel. Both can be factually accurate, yet the choice of emphasis subtly shapes which consequences feel most urgent to each audience. The mechanism is straightforward. Different communities consume different media diets, so the same uncertainty about one critical shipping choke point can produce dramatically different dominant fears. Next time you encounter sharply divergent tones on the same geopolitical development, it's worth asking which downstream effects each outlet chose to highlight and which ones it quietly left in the background. That awareness is one of the best tools for consuming news responsibly. Before we close, keep an eye on further updates from the US-Iran talks in Pakistan and any early market reactions to those jet fuel warnings. The interplay between diplomacy and economics will likely remain the dominant theme in the days ahead. That's OmniView. For full source links, primary documents, and more detailed written briefings, visit today's summary page. As always, compare outlets, look for primary sources, and try to separate what is known from what is assumed. If balanced perspectives are valuable to you, please share this episode with a friend and subscribe wherever you listen. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest developments from every angle. Stay curious. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.
Without taking the dive, we went on vacation. We had a nice time. My doomsday